My father left my brother the farm, my sister the money, and all I got was an old delivery truck. I never expected that a single phone call would turn my entire life upside down. Dad was gone. Just like that. No warning, no long decline, no chance to say goodbye. A heart attack took Richard Miller, respected farmer, community pillar, and the only person who never made me feel like the family disappointment, right in the middle of harvesting season. The funeral passed in a blur. People from 3 counties showed up, talking about how Dad had helped them through droughts, lent equipment when theirs broke down, or extended credit at the farmer's market when times were tough. I stood there nodding, shaking hands, accepting condolences, but inside I felt hollow, empty, like I was watching everything from behind thick glass. Mom had passed 5 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, and Dad had been my anchor ever since. Without him, I felt adrift in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lost their compass in life. Then came the reading of the will, and that's when I realized that losing Dad was just the beginning of my problems. We gathered at Miller & Associates, Dad's attorney for the past 30 years. The office smelled like leather and wood polish, and the air conditioner was cranked so high I could see goosebumps on Sarah's arms. My sister always dressed like she was heading to a photo shoot rather than a family meeting. Kevin, my older brother, sat with perfect posture in his tailored suit, looking impatient. He'd taken time away from his real estate empire in Chicago, and he made sure we all knew what an inconvenience that was. Mr. Miller, a man who seemed to have aged 40 years since I last saw him, shuffled papers at his desk. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner felt like a countdown to something I wasn't prepared for. Richard was very specific about his wishes. Mr. Miller began, adjusting his glasses. As you know, your father built Miller Farms from nothing. 60 acres when he started, now over 500 acres of prime agricultural land, plus the equipment, livestock, and facilities. Kevin nodded, already mentally calculating the value. Sarah was texting someone, barely paying attention. I just wanted it to be over so I could go home and process my grief in private. To Sarah Miller, Richard leaves a sum of $850,000, representing his liquid assets and investments. Sarah's head snapped up, her fingers freezing mid-text. Her shock gave way to a smile that didn't reach her eyes. To Kevin Miller, Richard leaves a farm, all associated lands, equipment in the family home, with the stipulation that the current farmhand be retained for a minimum of 1 year. Kevin didn't react beyond a single, satisfied nod, like he'd just closed a business deal that went exactly as expected. This wasn't surprising. Kevin had worked on the farm until college, then escaped the city as fast as possible. But everyone knew that eventually the eldest son would inherit the land. That's how things worked in our part of the country. I sat there waiting for my portion. Maybe the guest house? Dad's collection of vintage farm equipment? A smaller plot of land? I wasn't greedy, but surely there would be something substantial for me too. And to John Miller, Mr. Miller continued, glancing at me over his glasses, Richard leaves his 1972 Ford delivery truck and the contents therein. The silence that followed felt like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. I waited for more, but Mr. Miller just looked at me with an unreadable expression. Sarah broke first, a half-laugh escaping before she could stop it. That's it, the old truck. Kevin didn't even try to hide his smirk. What, seriously? Is John going to start a delivery service now? I felt heat rising from my collar to my face. The old delivery truck was Dad's pride and joy, sure. We'd spent countless hours tinkering under its hood together, but it was worth maybe $5,000 on a good day, while my siblings were walking away with millions. Mr. Miller cleared his throat. That concludes the distribution of assets. There are some additional documents for each of you to sign. While Mr. Miller explained the paperwork, I tried to make sense of it all. I'd stayed. When Kevin left for Chicago and Sarah moved to Nashville to pursue her marketing career, I was the one who remained in Oak Ridge. I helped Dad run the farm after Mom died. I was there every day for the past 5 years, working the land, fixing equipment, taking cattle to auction. Not because I had to, but because I knew how much the farm meant to Dad. And my reward was a 40-year-old truck? Don't worry, little brother, Kevin said, clapping a hand on my shoulder hard enough to make me wince. I might have some odd jobs around the farm you can help with. For old time's sake. Yeah, Johnny, Sarah added, not looking up from her phone. That old van probably needs a lot of work. Maybe you can sell it and buy yourself something nice. Like, I don't know, a decent shirt for once. I looked down at my flannel shirt and jeans, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked next to my polished siblings. The shirt was worn at the elbows because it was comfortable for farm work, not because I couldn't afford new clothes. Dad wanted me to have the truck, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. That's good enough for me. Always a loyal puppy, Kevin said with a snort. That's probably why he gave it to you. Sentimental value, and all that. Though honestly, even the truck seems like more than you deserve considering how the farm's profits have dropped since you started helping Dad. Something inside me snapped. 5 years of being responsible one. 5 years of early mornings and late nights, of calving season and harvest time equipment breakdowns, all while Kevin and Sarah built their perfect lives far away from the farm and the family that raised them. I slammed my fist on the table hard enough to make everyone jump. You know what? Keep your farm, Kevin. Keep your money, Sarah. I don't want anything from either of you. I stood up so fast my chair toppled backward. Mr. Miller looked alarmed, but I was already heading for the door. I couldn't breathe in that room anymore. Couldn't stand the sight of my siblings dividing up Dad's legacy like vultures while treating me like some charity case. As I reached the door, Mr. Miller called out, "John, a moment, please." I paused, hand on the doorknob, not turning around. "Your father wanted me to tell you something privately," he said, his voice low enough that Kevin and Sarah wouldn't hear. He said that the truck is more than it appears. Those were his exact words. I turned slightly, meeting the old lawyer's eyes. There was something there, a hint of knowledge, maybe even amusement. "What does that mean?" I asked. Mr. Miller shrugged. "That's all," he said. But Richard was never a man to waste words. "I suggest you take a very close look at that truck." With that cryptic advice ringing in my ears, I walked out into the bright summer sunshine. The parking lot was shimmering with heat, and there it sat, Dad's old blue Ford delivery truck. Paint faded from decades in the sun, a few spots of rust around the wheel wells. It looked exactly like what it was, an old delivery van that had seen better days. But Dad's words, relayed to his attorney, echoed in my mind. The truck is more than it appears. What the hell did that mean? And why would Dad leave everything of value to my siblings while giving me nothing but an old delivery van and a riddle? As I stood there staring at the boxy delivery truck that was now mine, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing. Something important. Dad was never cruel, and he was never careless with his decisions. If he left me just this old delivery van, there had to be a reason. I just had to figure out what that reason was. The day after the will reading, I packed my belongings into 2 duffel bags and moved out of the farmhouse. There was no way I could stay there now that Kevin owned the place. My brother had already started talking about modernizing operations and maximizing profit margins before Dad was even in the ground. The thought of working under him, being ordered around on land I'd helped tend for years, made my stomach turn. I found a small garage with a studio apartment above it on the edge of town. The owner, Pete Donovan, was an old-timer who remembered me from high school football games. He cut me a deal on the rent, $6.50 a month, utilities included. The place wasn't much, just 1 room with a kitchenette and bathroom, but it was mine. The garage below had enough space for Dad's delivery truck and a small workbench. It wasn't a farm, but it would do. That first week was rough. I'd wake up expecting to hear Dad's coffee grinder at 5 a.m., only to remember everything had changed. The silence in my new place was deafening. On Wednesday, I called Kevin to ask if I could borrow some tools to start working on the truck. The engine needed a tune-up, and I wanted to check the brakes before taking it on any long trips. Tools. Kevin laughed through the phone. "Those are farm assets now, Johnny. Dad left you that rust bucket, so you figure out how to fix it yourself." I hung up without another word. Next, I tried Sarah, thinking maybe she'd loan me some cash for tools, just until I got back on my feet. Her assistant answered and informed me that Sarah was in meetings all day. She never returned my call. The reality of my situation hit me hard that night. I had about $3,000 in savings, no job, an old delivery truck that barely ran, and a family that had ripped me off. I cracked open a beer and sat on a small balcony outside my apartment, watching the sunset and wondering where I'd gone wrong. The next morning, I decided to at least see if I could get the truck running properly. The engine turned over, but it made a concerning rattling noise when I accelerated. I figured I'd drive it to the auto parts store on Main Street and pick up some basic supplies, oil, filters, spark plugs. Maybe they'd let me use their diagnostic machine too. Of course, the truck chose that moment to die completely. I was halfway to town when it happened. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then went silent. Rain clouds that had been threatening all morning finally opened up, drenching me as I popped the hood to look at the engine, as if staring at it would somehow reveal all its secrets. I was soaked to the bone within minutes, trying to push the truck to the side of the road, when an old red Chevy pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, revealing Mr. Williams, who owned the hardware store in town and had been friends with Dad for decades. "John Miller, what in God's name are you doing out in this downpour?" he called out, rain spattering through his open window. I explained my situation, trying not to sound as pathetic as I felt. Pushing a dead truck down a country road in the rain, no tools, no help, no clue what I was doing. Mr. Williams shook his head. "Get in. We'll come back for this heap with my tow chain after the rain lets up." An hour later, we had managed to get the truck back to my garage. Mr. Williams disappeared briefly, returning with his toolbox and a paper bag from the diner down the street. "Ham and cheese, extra pickles," he said, placing the bag on my workbench. "Your dad's favorite. Figure it might be yours too." As we ate, Mr. Williams looked around my sparse garage. "Richard would be rolling in his grave if he knew Kevin wouldn't even loan you tools." "This isn't right, son." I shrugged, trying to act like it didn't bother me. "It is what it is." "Well, I got plenty of tools gathering dust in my shed. Consider them loaned indefinitely, and I might have some spare parts that would fit this old girl." He patted the truck's hood affectionately. "Your dad used to haul fertilizer and seed in this thing back in the day. Fed half the county with what he grew and delivered in this truck." That comment stopped me mid-bite. Dad used this for deliveries? I thought it was just as around-the-farm vehicle. Mr. Williams chuckled. "Oh, no. This was his first business venture. Before the farm really took off, Richard would load this up with produce and make deliveries all around the county. Had a little side business going for years. Even after the farm became successful, he loved this truck something fierce." I walked around the vehicle, seeing it with new eyes. It wasn't just a beat-up old delivery van. It had been Dad's first taste of entrepreneurship. Suddenly, the inheritance made a little more sense. Dad hadn't given me a useless hunk of metal. He'd given me his first business. "You know," I said slowly, an idea taking shape in my mind, "maybe I could use this for something similar." Mr. Williams raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "I'm not sure yet, but there's plenty of space in the back. It could be, I don't know, a mobile something." "Mobile coffee shop?" Mr. Williams suggested. "My daughter won't shut up about those fancy coffee trucks in the city. People line up for blocks, paying $6 for glorified bean water." The moment he said it, something clicked. I could picture it perfectly. The truck painted a deep blue, a serving window cut into the side, the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods. I'd been a pretty decent barista during college, working at the campus coffee shop to make extra money. I still remembered how to pull a good espresso shot. That could actually work, I said, excitement building. I'd need to outfit the back, install some equipment, but the structure is already perfect for it. Your mother had some damn fine pastry recipes too, Mr. Williams added. Those apple turnovers she'd bring to the church potluck? People would throw elbows to get to them first. For the first time since Dad died, I felt a spark of hope. This old truck wasn't just a consolation prize. It was an opportunity. I could create something of my own, something that honored both my parents in a way. 2 days later, I ran into Sarah at the local grocery store. She was in town checking on some rental property she owned, looking completely out of place in her designer clothes among the regular folk in their work clothes and casual wear. "Johnny," she said, sounding surprised to see me. "I thought you might have left town by now." "Nope, still here. Actually, I'm starting a business," I replied, unable to keep the excitement from my voice. "I'm converting Dad's truck into a mobile coffee shop." Sarah's expression shifted from surprise to amusement. "A coffee truck? Seriously? This is in Portland, Johnny. People here get their coffee at the diner or make it home. Times are changing," I said, trying to keep my tone even. Not everyone wants the same burnt diner coffee day after day. "Well, have fun playing barista," she said with a dismissive wave. "But don't come asking for money when it fails. Some of us have real businesses to run." Her words stung, but they also fueled my determination. I spent the next week researching mobile coffee businesses, watching YouTube tutorials on truck conversions, and making lists of equipment I'd need. Mr. Williams introduced me to his nephew, who did welding and metalwork, and together we started planning how to modify the truck's interior. I found Mom's recipe box in a storage tub I'd brought from farm. It was full of handwritten cards, each one with notes in her neat script. "Add extra cinnamon," or "works best with Granny Smith apples." I ran my fingers over her handwriting, feeling a connection to her I hadn't felt in years. The first test batch of her cinnamon rolls was a disaster. I forgot to proof the yeast, and they came out like hockey pucks. The second attempt was marginally better, edible, but not great. By the fifth try, they were starting to taste like I remembered from childhood. The coffee part came more naturally. I picked up a used espresso machine from a cafe that was upgrading their equipment and practiced making lattes and cappuccinos in my tiny kitchenette. More than once, I scalded myself on steam wands or spilled beans across the floor, but each mistake taught me something. 3 weeks after the will reading, I had a solid business plan, a partially converted truck, and about $500 left in my bank account. I'd need at least another $5,000 to finish outfitting the truck properly, money I didn't have. The local bank had already turned down my loan application. Apparently, a coffee truck wasn't considered a sound investment in rural America. I was under the truck checking the brake lines when my phone rang. It was Mr. Williams. "John, you remember Old Man Jenkins' property? The one with the apple orchard out on Route 16. I did. Jenkins had the best apple orchard in the county, and he made cider that people drove hours to buy in the fall. He's hosting a harvest festival next weekend, expecting a few hundred people. His usual coffee vendor canceled last minute. Something about a family emergency. I might have mentioned your new venture to him." My heart raced. This could be my first real test, a chance to see if people would actually buy what I was selling. But the truck wasn't ready. The service window wasn't installed. The interior wasn't fully converted. And I'd need supplies I couldn't afford. "I appreciate it, Mr. Williams, but I don't think I'm ready yet. Jenkins is willing to waive the vendor fee and loan you a tent if you can't use the truck yet. Said he'd even front you money for supplies if you split the profit 60-40. It wasn't ideal, but it was an opportunity. A chance to test my coffee and Mom's recipes before investing everything in the truck conversion. Tell him I'm in. I heard myself saying, "Good man," Mr. Williams replied. "Oh, and John? Richard would be proud. This is exactly the kind of gumption he valued, seeing an opportunity and grabbing it with both hands." After we hung up, I sat in the driver's seat of the old delivery truck, hands on the steering wheel. For the first time, I felt like I understood why Dad had left it to me. It wasn't about the vehicle itself. It was about what it represented. Possibility. Potential. A chance to build something of my own, just like he had. I had 1 week to prepare for the festival. 1 week to prove to myself, and maybe to Sarah and Kevin too, that Dad's old delivery truck wasn't just a piece of junk. It was the beginning of something that could change my life. The question was, could I pull it off? Or would I crash and burn, proving my siblings right about my worth? The morning of the Harvest Festival arrived with perfect fall weather, crisp air, golden sunshine, and just enough breeze to carry the scent of apples across Old Man Jenkins' orchard. I'd been up since 4 a.m., baking the last batch of Mom's cinnamon rolls and loading the rented equipment into my beat-up Honda Civic, since the delivery truck wasn't ready yet. Mr. Williams met me at the entrance to help unload. Jenkins had given us a prime spot near the entrance where people would pass by first thing after paying admission. We set up a simple tent with a folding table, my recently purchased espresso machine, and a display case for Mom's baked goods. Nothing fancy, but it looked clean and inviting. The night before, I'd stayed up making simple paper cups with a custom stamp that read, "Richard's Brew, coffee with heart." It was a last-minute idea, but something told me that connecting to Dad's memory might resonate with the locals who had known him. As the first festival goers began trickling in around 9 a.m., I felt my stomach knotting with anxiety. What if no one stopped? What if they tried my coffee and hated it? What if Sarah and Kevin were right, and this whole idea was just a desperate attempt to prove them wrong? The first hour was painfully slow. A few curious people stopped by, mostly old-timers who recognized me as Richard Miller's boy. They bought coffee out of politeness, not expectation. I could see the skepticism in their eyes. What did a farmer's son know about fancy coffee? Around 10:30, Mrs. Patterson, who had taught kindergarten in our town for 30 years, bought a cinnamon roll and took a bite right in front of me. "Good heavens," she exclaimed, eyes widening. "This tastes just like your mother's recipe from the church potlucks." She immediately called over her friends, and suddenly I had a small cluster of women in their 60s sampling my baked goods and nodding approvingly. Word spread quickly after that. By noon, I had a steady line of customers, many asking if these were really Elaine Miller's recipes. "They sure are," I'd tell them, pointing to the handwritten recipe card I'd framed and placed on the counter. Mom's originals, with all her notes. That emotional connection seemed to transform my little stand from just another coffee vendor into something special. People weren't just buying coffee and pastries. They were purchasing a piece of nostalgia, a connection to my parents who had been fixtures in the community for decades. By mid-afternoon, I was scrambling to keep up with demand. Mr. Williams' teenage grandson showed up to help, taking payments while I focused on making drinks and restocking the display case. I'd already sold out of cinnamon rolls and apple turnovers, with only a few scones left. I was so busy I almost didn't notice Sarah and Kevin arriving at the festival. They strolled up to my stand with matching expressions of surprise. Kevin was dressed like he was heading to a board meeting rather than a country harvest festival, and Sarah looked like she stepped out of Lifestyle magazine's fall fashion spread. "Well, look at this," Kevin said, surveying my modest setup with raised eyebrows. "Johnny's playing coffee shop. Cute." Sarah picked up one of my branded cups, examining it with a smirk. "Using Dad's name to sell coffee? That's a bit desperate, don't you think?" I ignored the jab and asked if they wanted anything. Kevin snorted and said he preferred real coffee, while Sarah muttered something about calories before they both walked away. I tried not to let it bother me, but their dismissiveness still stung, even amid my unexpected success. The real shock came around 3 p.m. when Jenkins himself stopped by, cup in hand. "This is damn good coffee, son," he said, nodding appreciatively. "And Martha says these scones remind her of your mother's baking. You got talent. You thinking of making this a regular thing?" Before I could answer, a local woman who ran a small photography business asked if she could take pictures of my stand for her Instagram. She thought the combination of handwritten recipe cards, the story of inheriting the business from my dad, and the quality of the products made for authentic content her followers would love. By the end of the day, I'd made nearly $1,200 in sales, well beyond my expectations. After giving Jenkins his cut and covering my expenses, I still clear about $500. Not life-changing money, but proof that my concept could work. More importantly, I had validation that people connected with what I was trying to do. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. The photographer had posted several shots of my stand, cups, and baked goods with the caption, "Best find at the Harvest Festival, family recipes, heartfelt story, and the best cinnamon rolls in the county. Can't wait to see it Richard's Brew turn that vintage truck into a full mobile cafe." I hadn't even created social media accounts yet, but she'd made one up and tagged it anyway. Her post had hundreds of likes and dozens of comments asking where people could find me next. Several local businesses had commented asking if I could park outside their locations once my truck was ready. I was still staring at my phone in disbelief when my landlord Pete knocked on my door, newspaper in hand. "You're famous, kid," he announced, showing me the small local paper. There I was, in the community section, standing behind my coffee stand with a line of customers. The headline read, "Miller Legacy Continues. Local man honors parents through new coffee venture." The article mentioned how I was converting my father's old delivery truck into a mobile coffee shop and highlighted the use of my mother's recipes. It was small-town news, but felt enormous to me. I immediately started work on the truck with renewed vigor. Mr. Williams' nephew helped me cut and install the service window, and a local handyman I knew from the farm helped with the interior build-out. I created proper social media accounts that quickly gained followers, mostly locals curious about when Richard's Brew would officially hit the streets. 3 weeks after the festival, I got a call from Jenkins. Another event was planned for the following weekend, a craft fair at the community center, and the organizer wanted to know if I'd be interested in being their coffee vendor. My truck still wasn't completely ready, but I agreed anyway, figuring I could make the temporary setup work again. That Thursday, I was at the grocery store buying supplies when I ran into Madison Chun, who'd worked with me at the university coffee shop years ago. She'd moved back to town recently after a stint at a high-end cafe in Chicago. "John Miller, I saw your picture in the paper. Coffee truck, huh? That's awesome," she said, genuinely excited. "If you ever need help, let me know. I've got barista experience and a culinary degree now." I was about to respond when I noticed Kevin across the store, watching us intently. He disappeared down an aisle before I could acknowledge him. The next day, Madison texted me saying she'd been offered a job managing one of Sarah's rental properties, a position that hadn't existed before and came with a surprisingly generous salary. She apologetically withdrew her offer to help, saying she couldn't pass up the opportunity. The timing seemed suspicious, but I tried not to read too much into it. Yet, when I arrived at the community center to set up a craft fair on Saturday morning, the organizer approached me with concerned expression. "Mr. Miller, there seems to be some confusion. We've received reports that you don't have the proper permits for food service. We can't let you operate without them." I was baffled. I'd researched the requirements carefully and had obtained all the necessary temporary permits for the event. When I showed her the paperwork, she seemed relieved but still concerned. "That's odd. Someone called specifically to warn us about this." They seemed quite certain. As I set my stand, I spotted Kevin and Sarah sitting in Kevin's luxury SUV in the parking lot, watching me. When they saw me looking, Kevin started the engine and drove away. The craft fair went even better than the Harvest Festival. Word had spread, and people came specifically looking for my coffee and baked goods. By mid-afternoon, I completely sold out and had to apologize to disappointed customers. As I was packing up, one of the other vendors, an older man selling handmade wooden crafts, approached me. "Your brother was asking me some mighty strange questions earlier," he said casually. "Want to know if I'd had any health concerns after eating your baked goods. Said something about questionable food handling practices." My blood ran cold. Kevin wasn't just dismissive of my business. He was actively trying to sabotage it. On my way home, I stopped at a local diner for dinner and overheard 2 women talking in the booth behind me. "Did you try that new coffee at the craft fair?" From Richard Miller's son. "I wanted to, but Sarah Miller, the fancy one who moved away, she told my daughter it's all for show. Said her brother doesn't actually use their mother's recipes and buys cheap ingredients." I don't know what to believe. The realization hit me like a truck. This wasn't just sibling rivalry or resentment over the inheritance. Kevin and Sarah were deliberately trying to undermine my business before it could even get off the ground. The permit confusion, the concerns about food safety, the rumors about fake recipes. They were systematically attacking everything that made my concept special. As I drove home, questions swirled in my mind. Why go to such lengths? What were they afraid of? I wasn't competing with either of their businesses. I wasn't threatening the family name. I was just trying to make something of myself with the only inheritance I'd received. Unless There was something more to Dad's old delivery truck than I had discovered, something that made Kevin and Sarah nervous enough to try to ensure my failure. That night, I went down to the garage and examined every inch of the truck, looking for hidden compartments or secret messages. I found nothing unusual, but my gut told me I was missing something important. Dad wouldn't have left me just a vehicle. There had to be more to it, something that explained my siblings' bizarre behavior. The next morning, I received a text from the community center organizer. She'd heard from 3 different people that my coffee had made them sick. She was sorry, but they couldn't invite me back for future events. I knew instantly who was behind the rumors. The question was, how far would Kevin and Sarah go to stop me? After the community center debacle, I felt defeated. Kevin and Sarah were playing dirty, and their tactics were working. Local event organizers were suddenly booked solid when I called, and I heard whispers of food safety concerns following me around town. It seemed my coffee business might be over before it truly began. I spent a full day sulking in my apartment, wondering if I should just sell the truck and move to another town. Maybe my siblings were right. Maybe I wasn't cut out for business. I was just a farm kid who'd gotten lucky at a couple of local events. The next morning, determined to at least finish what I'd started, I headed down to the garage to continue working on the truck. The interior was nearly complete, with the espresso machine installed and storage areas built out. All that remained was painting the exterior and adding signage. As I cleaned out the last of the storage compartments to prepare for painting, I found something wedged behind the driver's seat, a small wooden box I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't locked, just dusty from years of neglect. Inside was a faded photograph of Dad standing proudly next to the delivery truck when it was new, along with a handwritten note. To whoever finds this truck after me, remember to help when you can. The best investment isn't money, it's goodwill. Richard Miller. I sat on the garage floor, staring at the note. Dad hadn't been much for sentimental speeches or life lessons. He taught by example, not words. Finding this message felt like he was speaking directly to me from beyond the grave. That same afternoon, I saw a flyer at the local hardware store about an upcoming Veterans Benefit event. The organizer, an old Vietnam vet named Frank Russo, was looking for food vendors to support the gathering. My first instinct was to call and offer my services, but then I remembered Dad's note. Instead of calling Frank to negotiate a vendor spot, I showed up at his house with a box of Mom's apple turnovers and offered to provide free coffee and pastries for all the volunteers and veterans at the event. No charge, no profit. Frank was suspicious at first. Nobody does something for nothing, son. What's your angle? I showed him Dad's note and explained the situation with my siblings and the inheritance. By the time I finished my story, Frank's weathered face had softened considerably. Your dad was a good man, he said. Helped me out when I came back from Nam and couldn't find work. Most folks didn't want to hire a damage vet, but Richard gave me a job on his farm, no questions asked. He looked at the note again. This sounds exactly like him. Always had a good reputation, was worth more than money in the bank. The Veterans Benefit was scheduled for the following weekend. I spent every waking hour preparing, baking in the pre-dawn hours, and finalizing the truck's exterior during the day. I painted it navy blue with Richard's Brew in vintage-style lettering on the sides. Under the name, I added Coffee with Heart and a small sketch of the original delivery truck. 2 days before the event, I received a call from the county fairgrounds manager informing me that my permit to participate in the summer festival had been revoked due to multiple complaints. I didn't need to ask who was behind those complaints. Then, the morning of the Veterans Benefit, Frank called in a panic. John, we got a problem. Someone reported us to the health department, saying we've got unlicensed vendors. Inspectors coming at noon. My heart sank. I had all the proper permits. But an inspection on my first official day with the truck would be stressful at best, disastrous at worst. I couldn't help but suspect Kevin or Sarah had called in the complaint. Despite the setback, I arrived early and parked the newly painted truck in the designated area. Veterans and their families immediately noticed the retro vehicle, and several came over to admire it and share stories about my dad. When the health inspector arrived, I was ready with all my paperwork. He seemed surprised that everything was in order, mentioning that the anonymous complaint had been quite detailed about alleged violations. After a thorough inspection, he signed off on my permits and even bought a coffee before leaving. Throughout the day, I served free coffee and pastries to dozens of veterans and volunteers. Many tried to pay anyway, but I insisted on honoring Dad's philosophy. Instead, I set up a donation jar for the Veterans Organization, which filled up quickly. A local reporter covering the event took an interest in my story. She interviewed me about the truck, the inheritance situation, and my commitment to supporting veterans in honor of my father. I mentioned Dad's note and his belief in community investment, careful not to say anything negative about my siblings despite their actions. The next morning, her article appeared on the front page of the local section. Local man honors father's legacy, serves community despite family feud. The piece detailed how I'd been left only the delivery truck of my father's will, but had transformed it into a thriving business, culminating in my decision to serve veterans for free. Within hours, my social media accounts exploded with new followers. People from neighboring counties were messaging to ask where they could find my coffee truck. A regional radio station called requesting an interview about the inheritance coffee truck, as they called it. By midweek, I was fielding calls from event organizers who suddenly had openings in their schedules. The owner of a popular brunch spot in town reached out about potentially featuring my coffee and pastries in his restaurant. Even a small regional distributor expressed interest in bottling a cold brew version of my coffee for local grocery stores. The most surprising call came from Meredith Watkins, who owned a successful restaurant group in the state capital. She'd read the article and wanted to discuss potential investment opportunities. "Your story has legs, John," she said. "People love the combination of quality products and authentic narrative. I think we could scale this concept across the state, maybe even regionally." I was still processing her offer when the bell above my garage door jingled. I looked up to find Kevin and Sarah standing there, both looking like they'd swallowed something sour. "So you're quite the local celebrity now," Kevin said, glancing around the garage with new interest. "Impressive for a coffee truck." Sarah studied the newly painted exterior of the vehicle. "This whole honoring Dad angle is clever marketing. I'll give you that." I waited for the insults or threats, but instead, Kevin pulled out his phone and showed me a sleek business proposal. "We've been thinking. This is potential beyond a one-man operation. Sarah and I have the capital and business connections to take this statewide. Professional management, multiple trucks, merchandise, the works." The proposal outlined a business structure where they would be majority owners, and I would be brought on as a brand ambassador with a modest salary and small equity stake. They'd even created a mock-up of a modernized logo that replaced the vintage aesthetic with something more corporate. "You can keep making coffee and telling stories about Dad," Sarah added. "We'll handle the business side. It's what we're good at." It was a masterful move. They couldn't beat me, so now they want to control me, to take what I'd built and turn it into another asset in their portfolios. When I didn't immediately respond, Kevin's tone hardened. "Be realistic, Johnny. You've had a good run with the local yokels, but you're out of your depth. Meredith Watkins isn't the only investor who's noticed you. We've already had discussions with several groups who are interested in our version of this concept." "Your version?" I asked, bewildered. Sarah shrugged. "Dad's recipes, Dad's story, they're family assets. We have just as much right to them as you do. And with our business backgrounds, investors will naturally prefer partnering with us." The implication was clear. Either I'd join them on their terms, or they would simply launch a competing business with my concept, leveraging their connections and capital to overwhelm me. I told them I needed time to think, which they took as encouragement. Kevin left their proposal on my workbench, along with a contract giving them right of first refusal on any investment deals I might consider. After they left, I sat in the driver's seat of Dad's truck, running my fingers over the steering wheel he'd gripped for decades. The small wooden box with his note sat on the passenger seat. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications and messages. The article had gone semi-viral, and people from across the state were sharing my story. One message caught my eye. A woman named Eleanor Jenkins, who claimed to have been Dad's accountant years ago, asking to meet as soon as possible. There's something about your father's business affairs you should know, her message read, especially now that you're making a name for yourself with his old truck. I stared at the message, then at the contract Kevin had left. What did Eleanor know? And was there still some secret about the truck or Dad's business that I hadn't discovered? Something that might explain Kevin and Sarah's sudden interest in partnership after months of sabotage? Whatever it was, I needed to find out quickly. With investors circling and my siblings threatening to steal my concept, I was running out of time to decide my next move. Everything I'd built over the past months hung in the balance. I met Eleanor Jenkins at a small diner outside town the next morning. She was in her 70s. With sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades dealing with other people's finances. Your father and I worked together for nearly 20 years, she explained, stirring her coffee methodically. I handled the books for the farm, but also for his other ventures. Other ventures? This was news to me. Dad had always been just a farmer in my eyes. Eleanor nodded. Richard was more entrepreneurial than most people realized. That delivery truck you inherited, it wasn't just for hauling produce. Your father had a small batch coffee business on the side for years. Nothing huge, but loyal customers throughout the county. She explained that Dad had sourced specialty beans from small farmers abroad, roasted them himself in a converted shed behind the barn, and sold the coffee at farmers markets and through local shops. It was a passion project that had developed a cult following. He called it Miller's Brew, Eleanor continued. Sound familiar? I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd named my business Richard's Brew without knowing Dad had already built something similar years ago. Why didn't I know about this? I asked, genuinely confused. I worked with him on the farm for the last 5 years. He scaled it back when your mother got sick. Then after she passed, he shut down the operation almost entirely. That old shed behind the north field that was always locked, that was his roasting facility. He'd still go there occasionally on those days. He'd tell you he had errands in town, maintaining just a handful of loyal customers who'd been with him for decades. He was very private about it. I think it was connected to memories of your mother as they started it together. Eleanor paused, studying my surprised expression. The last 2 years, he'd been talking about reviving it. He was renovating that shed bit by bit whenever you were busy with the East Fields. I think he was planning to surprise you with it, bring you in as a partner. The heart attack came before he could finish. Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a folder. Your father came to see me about 6 months before he died. He updated his will and filed these papers. Inside were trademark registrations for Miller's Brew and Richard's Blend, along with several coffee recipes and a formal business plan. All the documents named me as the successor owner. Richard knew exactly what he was doing when he left you that truck, Eleanor said. It wasn't just sentiment. He was leaving you a business foundation with legal protection. My mind was racing. No wonder Kevin and Sarah were suddenly interested in partnership. They must have discovered or remembered Dad's coffee business and realized its potential value now that I'd unknowingly revived it. I thanked Eleanor and drove straight to my garage, where I conducted a more thorough inspection of the truck. In a hidden compartment on the floor, I found a metal lockbox containing more of Dad's business records, supplier contacts, customer lists, and detailed roasting notes for various blends. There was also a sealed envelope with my name on it. Inside was a handwritten letter. John, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've discovered what this old truck really means. I always knew you had the heart to understand what matters most in business. When others are blinded by greed and quick profits, you see the value in relationships and quality. I'm leaving you more than just a vehicle. I'm leaving you a legacy to build on your own terms. The coffee business brought me joy and connected me people in a way the farm never could. I hope it can do the same for you. Kevin and Sarah will have their inheritances, but this is yours. I've made sure the legal protections are in place. They can't take this from you unless you let them. Trust yourself, son. You've always had better instincts than you give yourself credit for. Dad, I sat there holding the letter, overcome with emotion. Dad hadn't overlooked me in his will. He'd given me something potentially more valuable than land or money. He'd given me a purpose that was perfectly suited to who I am. The next morning, Kevin called to ask if I considered their offer. I told him I needed more time and had a meeting with Meredith Watkins first. He sounded irritated, but couldn't object without revealing their desperation to control the situation. My meeting with Meredith was eye-opening. She'd done her research on the local coffee market and discovered references to Dad's original Miller's Brew business. Your father had quite a reputation in specialty coffee circles, she explained. Old-timers still talk about his roasts. There's serious value in reviving that legacy authentically. I showed her Dad's letter and documentation. She was impressed with the trademark protections and the detailed business records. This changes everything, she said. With these assets and your current momentum, we could structure a much more advantageous investment package. 2 days later, Kevin and Sarah invited me to dinner at an upscale restaurant to finalize our partnership. I agreed to meet them, curious to see how far they would go. The restaurant was the kind of place where they fold your napkin when you go to the bathroom. Kevin had reserved a private dining room and arrived with glossy presentation materials and a revised contract. Sarah brought her lawyer. "We've been busy," Kevin announced proudly, sliding a tablet across the table. On it was a website for Miller Family Coffee Company, featuring sleek modern branding and photos of a renovated storefront downtown. We signed the lease yesterday. Grand opening in 3 weeks. I scrolled to the site, noting they'd appropriated Mom's recipes, Dad's story, and even my coffee truck concept, repackaged in a more corporate style. We've scheduled meetings with 3 different investor groups next week, Sarah added. They're very excited about our expansion plan. 10 locations in 3 years, with you as the face of the brand. The contract they presented would give me 15% ownership and a salary, while they controlled everything from recipes to branding. They'd effectively be purchasing the right to my story and Dad's legacy for pennies on the dollar. "This is a generous offer," Kevin insisted. "You're a natural with customers, Johnny, but scaling requires expertise and capital. That's what we bring to the table." I took a sip of water. Consider my response. Then I reached into my messenger bag and placed Dad's letter and the trademark documentation on the table. "Did you know Dad had a coffee business for years?" I asked calmly. Their expressions answered before their mouths could. Sarah recovered first, forcing a smile. "Of course we knew. It was a little hobby he tinkered with. A hobby he legally protected with trademarks and formally transferred to me." I corrected her, including exclusive rights to all his recipes and the Miller name in connection with coffee products. The lawyer picked up the documents, scanning them with increasing concern. She whispered something to Kevin, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is a dirty trick," he sputtered. "You hid these documents during the state settlement." "I didn't know they existed until yesterday." I replied honestly. "Dad hid them in the truck. The only thing he left me in his will. Interesting how that worked out." Sarah's composure cracked. "So what? You can have your little truck and Daddy's precious recipes. We've already secured commitments from suppliers and investors who know the Miller name. You're nothing without our connections." "Actually," I said, "I've accepted an investment offer from Meredith Watkins. She's particularly interested in the authentic revival of Dad's original specialty coffee business, complete with legal protections and genuine family history." I stood up, gathering Dad's documents. "You're welcome to open your coffee shop, but you can't use Dad's recipes, Mom's baking techniques, or any variation of Miller's Brew. My lawyer will be sending cease and desist letters to your investors tomorrow morning." Kevin's face flushed with anger. "You ungrateful little. We're trying to help you succeed. You think you can compete with us? We'll crush your pathetic truck business." I looked at my siblings, really looked at them, and felt something shift inside me. They weren't villains in my story. They were just people who'd never understood what Dad had tried to teach us. That business wasn't just about profit margins and expansion plans. It was about people, connections, and doing something you believed in. "I'm not trying to compete with you," I said finally. "I'm honoring Dad in my own way. You're still my family, and there's room for both of us in this town. If you ever want to collaborate fairly, my door is open." I left them sitting in stunned silence. The next month was a whirlwind. With Meredith's investment, I secured a small roasting facility to recreate Dad's original blends using his detailed notes. I hired Madison, who quit her position with Sarah after the truth came out, and 2 other employees to help operate the truck and manage our growing schedule of events. For months after Dad died, I stood at the county fair watching people line up 20 deep for a cup of Richard's brew. I now had 2 trucks, the original, which I still operated personally most days, and a newer model that handled larger events. We'd secured contracts with 3 local restaurants to supply coffee, and our online store was shipping Dad's signature roasts nationwide. Kevin and Sarah's Miller Family Coffee Company opened to mediocre reviews and sparse crowds. Without Mom's authentic recipes or Dad's coffee expertise, they were just another generic coffee shop with premium pricing. Last I heard, Kevin was considering selling the space. As for the farm, Kevin eventually hired a management company to run it, rarely visiting himself. It was profitable but lacked the community connection it had during Dad's time. The following spring, I received separate texts from both Kevin and Sarah within days of each other, asking to meet. Kevin admitted their coffee shop was struggling and suggested a mutually beneficial arrangement. Sarah, more directly, acknowledged that I had built something meaningful and wanted to understand how I'd done it. I invited them both to the roasting facility, where I'd hung a sign reading, "In memory of Richard Miller, farmer, coffee craftsman, father." I showed them Dad's original roasting setup that I discovered in that lock shed behind the Northfield, a building that, according to the detailed property maps in Dad's papers, wasn't actually part of the main farm, but a separate parcel registered solely in my name. Kevin had never even realized it wasn't included in his inheritance. I'd carefully restored the equipment, preserving Dad's handwritten labels and modifications. This was never about the money for Dad. I explained. It was about creating something that brought people together, something with heart and history behind it. Sarah, looking at the busy production floor, asked whether I might consider bringing them in as legitimate partners, not controllers, in specific aspect of the business where their skills could actually help. I didn't say yes immediately, but I didn't say no either. Family is complicated, and second chances are part of the package. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat in Dad's old delivery truck in the empty parking lot. The vehicle that once seemed like a worthless inheritance had become the cornerstone of something meaningful. It wasn't just a business. It was Dad's final lesson about seeing value where others saw only junk, about building connections when others focused on assets. "Thanks, Dad," I whispered, patting the worn steering wheel. "I finally understand why you left me the truck." Sometimes the most valuable inheritances aren't the ones that come with the biggest price tags. They're the ones that force you to find your own path and provide just enough guidance to help you succeed.